You may remember that the Pope John Paul II was shot on May 13th, 1981. At that early phase of the discussion of the plot against the Pope, it was developed that the assassin, or the attempted assassin, Mehmet Ali Aca, was a Turkish fascist who'd been associated with a right-wing organization called the Grey Wolves in Turkey, with which he'd been associated since high school days. And as far as anyone could tell, he had continuous associations with him up to the time of the shooting. In fact, he'd been arrested for shooting somebody in Turkey in 1979. He'd been jailed, and he escaped from jail with the assistance of a number of his fellow members of the Grey Wolves. And he then fled Turkey and moved around Western Europe for some time. All through his travels in Western Europe, he was associated with Grey Wolves. From the very earliest days after the shooting, conservatives in the West started to talk about a possible association of Aca and the shooting with the East, with the Soviet bloc. You'll recall that Aca was shot in Aca shot the Pope in 1981, just at the time Mr. Reagan announced that the United States was concerned with terrorism, and at the very time that the United States was starting a large arms buildup, and an attempt was being made to designate the Soviet Union as an evil empire. In 1981, also, Claire Sterling wrote the book called The Terror Network, which attempted to argue that all the terrorism of the world was emerging from the Soviet Union.
He was right, Devin. He thought of everything.
The shooting of the Pope occurred at a very significant moment in history when there was this attempt to build up some kind of moral environment for the kinds of policies that Reaganism involved. So there was the opportunity to tie Aca to the East, in part because he had gone through Bulgaria and stayed in Sofia for some uncertain length of time. And in fact, the Reader's Digest in 1981 hired Claire Sterling and also hired a longtime CIA official named Paul Henze to study the possible relationship of the shooting to the East. And Sterling worked on this and wrote an article that was published in the Reader's Digest in September 1982. There were a lot of people among the conservatives of the West that were looking for a link to the East. The Reader's Digest, the intelligence services of the West. One very important event that occurred is that in late December 1981, members of the intelligence services of Italy visited Aca in prison, and they allegedly offered him a deal. They tried to explore with him the extent to which there were international complications or connections to the plot. And Aca later told his lawyer that he had been offered a deal, that if he would implicate the East, he might have a reduced sentence. And just shortly after that incident, the investigative judge talked to Aca, and in this judge's report, his name was Martella, he actually acknowledges that he suggested to Aca that if he was a good boy and that is talked, he might get a reduced sentence. In just a few months later, Aca started to talk. That is late March 1982. Aca suddenly agreed that he was going to talk. And he did at that point say the Bulgarians were involved. But an interesting fact is that he didn't name a Bulgarian for 7 more months. He agreed to talk in late March 1982. But it wasn't until late October 1982 that he finally named some Bulgarians. So that means it took 7 months after he was agreeable to talking. And that was, of course, 10 months after he had been originally incarcerated and interrogated and imprisoned. So it was 17 months after he had been first jailed that he finally named the Bulgarian. What he said was that the Bulgarians had been involved with him in great detail in Rome itself, that they had actually, he had visited them in their apartments, and he had actually planned the event in detail, walked to St. Peter's, inspected St. Peter's Square, looked at all the possibilities with several different Bulgarian officials in Rome, and that they had planned it in detail. And several of them, in fact, accompanied him to the assassination attempt on May 13th. So Adja confessed. Now, common sense tells us this was a rather suspicious affair, but the American media didn't raise any significant questions. Like a number of significant questions that would occur, as far as I'm concerned, to a person just using simple common sense would be, wasn't this a very long time lag for the confession? This man was in a Western prison. Isn't it suspicious that he would be in a Western prison and confess to what was convenient to the West after this 17-month time lag? Well, with this background, the Western media should have been very suspicious, but they were not. They accepted Adja's confessions and his claims of Bulgarian connection without any really serious analyses or serious critique. An open media, an open-minded media, a minimally critical media would have raised some very serious questions right off the bat. For example, wasn't it amazingly convenient from the standpoint of the Reagan program that the Soviets should be implicated in the plot? And wasn't it an amazing coincidence also that it took 17 months for the facts to get out from Adja? It would seem to me that those two things juxtaposed would suggest possible manipulation of Adja in prison. Then there was the fact that the Secret Service talked to him, and the Italian press was full of claims in December of 1981 and January, February 1982, that Adja had been offered a deal. And Adja himself admitted that he'd been offered a deal, and Martella admitted that he'd offered a deal, and yet the American press didn't latch on to the possibility that a deal had been struck, that Adja had been offered something in exchange for implicating the Bulgarians. Then the structure of the case also was extremely weird. For example, Claire Sterling's Reader's Digest article on Paul Henze and most of the original claimants about the Bulgarian connection stressed the fact that Adja had gone to Sofia, Bulgaria, and stayed there, possibly for some weeks or months. This was alleged to show that he was a Bulgarian agent. But logically, this doesn't hold water at all. If, in fact, the Russians and the Bulgarians had hired Adja, they wouldn't want to bring him to Sofia, where the intelligence agencies of the West would see that he would be able to observe his presence. So on the logic of plausible deniability, the fact that he came to Sofia, Bulgaria, would suggest that he wasn't a Bulgarian agent. This was not discussed in the American media. Also then, of course, when it was then claimed that the Bulgarians were involved with Adja in Rome, invited him to to their houses, and went with him to search out the situation at St. Peter's Square. The whole thing became quite ludicrous because Sterling and company had always claimed that the Bulgarians and Russians were very smart, very professional, and that they would always hide behind the cover of plausible deniability. They wouldn't let their hand be disclosed. And yet here are Bulgarian officials allegedly going with Adja to scout out the grounds, with him to throw smoke bombs. The whole thing was utterly ludicrous and implausible. There's almost no question that the Bulgarian embassy is under constant surveillance by Italian and US intelligence, and therefore these contacts with Adja would be easily detected. The whole thing made no sense, but the American media didn't discuss this at all. They also didn't discuss the fact a very important event that finally occurred was Adja finally in June 1983 admitted that he'd never visited Antonov's apartment. Antonov was the principal Bulgarian who was allegedly his accomplice. He had previously said he visited his apartment, met his wife and daughter. In June 1983, he told the investigating magistrate that this was not true. So he essentially withdrew a very key claim that Sterling and company had argued was really pretty persuasive evidence, because he had actually indicated details of Antonov's apartment and a lot of little fine points that proved he'd been there. Now he said he wasn't there. Now that was really quite a compelling confession. In fact, the American media didn't even record the fact that Adja had recanted until 1 year later, when there was a report, finally a report by the prosecutor, and the prosecutor acknowledged that Adja had withdrawn evidence. That was the first time the Western media, were 1 year late, acknowledged that Adja had made some very significant withdrawals of evidence. So the media's performance on this was remarkably undistinguished and remarkably gullible. They liked the line, apparently, and they followed it through. The New York Times was one of the worst performers in this respect. From the very beginning of the case, the Times would always pass on the strongest claims without any critical comment at all. And they, for years, suppressed any dissenting views and any dissenting analyses or facts. There was really quite massive suppression of fact, and alternative opinion was essentially kept out of the Times. In fact, in June 1984, the prosecutor Albano's report was given to Times readers on the front page by Claire Sterling herself. And in the course of that article, she suppressed the fact that Adja had withdrawn significant testimony, although that was possibly the most important thing in the prosecutor's report from the standpoint of an American audience. The Times, all through the case, when prosecutors' claims were being given, the Times would always say that this was pretty strong stuff, very compelling stuff, even though these were merely prosecutors' claims. Now, when the trial occurred and Adja started to fall apart, claimed he was Jesus Christ, and it was becoming more and more apparent that the case was being lost, the Times gradually withdrew from the case. It got quieter and quieter. But then when the case was over, the court, having decided that the Bulgarians should not be held and the case was dismissed for lack of evidence, the Times, instead of saying, gee, the case was lost, in spite of the strong case that we saw in earlier years, the prosecution's case, it was not sustainable after a very extended investigation. Let me look now at this article by John Tagliabue called Verdict on Papal Plot, but No Answer. Well, the first thing I note about this article is that it says there's no answer. In fact, there was an answer. The court decided that the case should be dismissed for lack of evidence against all the relevant parties. The New York Times' position, as I mentioned to you, was that the case was inconclusive, and this is the stress of Tagliabue. He doesn't stress the fact that after 23 months, huge amount of time of investigative work by Martella, and then a very long jury trial in which numerous witnesses were heard, they were not able to assemble evidence that confirmed the claims of Adja, and the case was therefore dismissed for lack of evidence. I would say an objective third party would say that an answer had been rendered by the Italian court, but not Tagliabue. He goes on and says, few people were surprised by the verdict since the public prosecutor, in an unusual plea last month, admitted his lack of conclusive evidence for a Bulgarian connection and asked for the Bulgarians' acquittal. Well, notice that the language, few people were surprised. Actually, his time horizon for the surprise is rather narrow. One could otherwise say that since the American public had been told by Sterling, Henze, and the New York Times for years that the case was growing in quality and in conclusiveness, that it was a great surprise that the Bulgarian connection couldn't be proved in a court of law. But what he does is turn it around so that the question of surprise is based on what the prosecutor had said one month previously, a very nice little rhetorical trick. What he tries to do is first of all, he gives Adja a lot of credibility right off the bat. He says, in the 3-month investigation that led to the trial, Mr. Adja had given investigators with many backtracks, contradictions, and corrections a broad picture of events leading up to the assassination attempt. Notice how he says a broad picture of events, not claimed events. In fact, it was these claims that the court was not sustained in the court. So here he is portraying Adja's picture, a broad picture. What Adja said was that some Bulgarians had done these things with me, and he gave numerous details, vast numbers of which were contradicted and which he withdrew. But instead of stressing that, he stresses the fact that a broad picture was drawn of events, when in fact a very gross picture was drawn with many alleged events, most of which were refuted and didn't convince the court. He then says, the court pushed its efforts through last summer. He tries then to blame the collapse of the case on the fact that Adja went into a shell. He says, on the first day's trial, Adja did an about-face. The Turkish gunman refused to discuss the details of his charges of a Bulgarian connection, merely stating repeatedly, I confirm everything. Now, this is inaccurate. In fact, Adja did try to confirm various things. He had numerous confrontations with witnesses, and while he did sometimes say, I confirm everything, very often he tried to confirm in detail and wasn't very successful and was pushed around. So that's a misstatement. But he's trying to set up the article to show that it was Adja's withdrawal and refusal to cooperate that caused the case to fall apart. He says, the court pushed its effort through last summer, but Mr. Marini and the other members of the court were never able to come up with corroborating evidence for assertions Mr. Adja had described in such detail. And without his assistance, the search was to prove futile. Now, why is it that the assertions were not verifiable if they'd been made in detail previously? I mean, why could the independent court, now with enormous options and resources, why couldn't they confirm these details? Or why weren't they confirmed by Martella, who had done a 23-month investigation and a 10-month court case? Why did you still need Adja to confirm things? I mean, why weren't the facts confirmable with these huge court resources? This is an extremely biased presentation. He does say, there were partial confirmations of Mr. Adja's complex tale. He said, Mr. Ozbey, who was a Turkish gray wolf friend of Adja, said that the Bulgarians had indeed wanted to use Adja to shoot the Pope, but did not trust him. Now that I was able to confirm is an absolute misstatement of fact. I happen to know somebody who was at the trial, who was a correspondent there, who told me that he in fact speaks Italian himself, and the Ozbey speaks Turkish. And what Ozbey said, according to the interpreter, was that the Bulgarians listened politely but were not interested. And my correspondent says that that was pretty close to it. The Bulgarians essentially didn't trust the Turks. And at no point in Ozbey's testimony did anybody say that the Bulgarians had wanted to use him to shoot the Pope. That's an absolute fabrication constructed by Mr. Tagliabue. He then goes on and says, get this confirmation of evidence. Mr. Shotley was another very important gray wolf witness. He says, Mr. Shotley hinted at obscure Secret Service contacts with West German intelligence and of payments for unspecified purposes to Turks involved in the investigations. Now that's a rather amazing bit of partial confirmation. There were somebody hinted at obscure Secret Service connections for unstated purposes. And the New York Times' man says that that's, in some sense, a partial confirmation of what Adja was saying. That's really, I think that should go down in the historical record. He goes on to say that the verdict is likely to turn the Bulgarian connection into one of many judicial battles that remain belatedly contested. The Italian court's ambiguity gives grounds for some critics to continue to maintain that the Bulgarians, probably at the instigation of the Soviet Union, arranged the shooting to eliminate the Polish-born Pope, presumably in an effort to crack religious-inspired resistance to communist rule in Poland. Well, that's the classic motive that Sterling and company have put forward, that the point of the Soviet-sponsored shooting was to quell the solidarity resistance. He goes on and says something along the same line later, swelling resistance to communism in Poland. But what he doesn't point out is that the alleged plot was hatched before solidarity existed, that Adja had threatened to shoot the Pope in 1979, long before solidarity existed. And in fact, he doesn't mention that many people have pointed out that shooting the Pope wouldn't have helped the Russians at all. If they had shot the Pope, would that have stopped solidarity? I mean, even though they didn't shoot the Pope, all the Poles believed they tried to shoot the Pope. And if he'd been successfully killed, would the Poles have been quite pleased and been lapsed into apathy? The whole thing doesn't make any sense. So he doesn't give any of these counter-arguments. He just leaves the old Sterling line hanging there that there was a motive to shoot the Pope without giving any counter-evidence of which there is a voluminous quantity. He says, whether or not the charges against the Bulgarians were true, their emergence at the nadir of Soviet-American relations in the early 1980s gained them additional credence among many in the West. So, in other words, things were looked bad between the West and the Soviets in the early 80s, and that gained credence. But notice he doesn't say the possibility that might have explained why the Bulgarian connection was formulated, which is what I believe to be true. In my model, it occurred because Reagan needed it, the Italian conservatives needed it, Adja was in prison, he could be worked over easily, and therefore this low point in relations helps explain the plot. He doesn't mention that possibility. He says the key factual question is probably how Adja knew what he knew and when he knew it. On the answer to this question hangs the credibility of his charges. And then he goes on to say that Adja revealed many details about the Bulgarians, descriptions of their apartments, details of their personal habits, phone numbers, and nicknames. Now then goes on to say the simplest explanation is he read it in the newspapers. But then he says this is rather remarkable. But even attorneys for the Bulgarians acknowledged that many of the details did not appear in Italian publications, if at all, until after Mr. Adja mentioned them to his interrogators. Now, in fact, the reason the Bulgarians established that was that Adja had withdrawn his claims that he had visited Antonov's apartment. So here he had given a lot of details about Antonov's personal habits and the nicknames of his wife and daughter. But then in June 1983, he told the judge that he'd never been there. Well, the question then came up, how did he know those details if he now confessed that he wasn't there? So it was in that context that the Bulgarians and the defense attorneys scouted around and they found that no such details had appeared in the Italian or Turkish or any other press. Therefore, if he hadn't been there and it didn't appear in the press, how did he know it? The answer is somebody told him in prison.
At first, Ajka's story was that Antonov had been pointed out to him for the first time on May 12th and wore a blondish beard.
But notice how Tagliabue twists this around and doesn't mention the fact that he says the Bulgarians admitted that there was no way he could have gotten out of the newspapers without pointing out that they had done that precisely because he had withdrawn his claim that he'd been there.
Later, Ajka recognized Antonov in a photo with a black beard. He followed with 6 different stories of their first meeting.
He says, Mr. Adja is known to have spent nearly 2 months in Bulgaria in the summer of 1980, and information gleaned from such stays could have formed the basis of his later assertion. So he suggests maybe Adja got information about Antonov's personal habits and so on because he was in Sofia for a couple of months. First of all, it wasn't established that he was there for a couple of months. It was only established firmly that he was there a few days. He may or may not have been there a couple of months. But Adja, nobody, including Adja, has ever claimed that he ever heard of Antonov or any of the, let's stick to Antonov, he had never met Antonov until he had come to Rome. So how could he have gotten personal details about Antonov? On what occasion would he? He says this, the more sinister view about how Adja got these details, the more sinister view, notice the loaded word sinister, the more sinister view, espoused by critics of the case on the political left, including Soviet bloc governments, is that Mr. Adja was fed the information by Western intelligence services intent on building a bloc against a case against the Soviet bloc. Then espoused by critics, notice he then trashes it by suggesting that it's only espoused by the Soviet bloc and critics on the left, ignoring any substantive questions. Meanwhile, he has suppressed all the accumulated evidence. Even this man Tagliabue, on page 5 of the New York Times, many months previously, had to put in the fact that a man named Giuseppe Pandico, who was the chief Italian witness in a major case against the mafia in Naples, gave a very important interview in which he said he was present on the occasion when his boss, his mafia boss in Adja's prison, and several Secret Service agents and some other people got together and got Adja to agree to talk. This made a sensation in Italy. And Tagliabue even had to mention it on page 5, although it was a shattering confession. It blew the whole case apart. And then subsequently, another very important man named Pazienza, who was a friend of Michael Ledeen and a friend of Alexander Haig, and who was in jail in the United States, himself acknowledged that the Italian Secret Services had been in on coaching Adja. There have been a lot of others too, and all this is in the Italian press. And the accumulated in other words, the smoking guns are there, plus huge amounts of circumstantial evidence of people who are interested in getting Adja to talk. Inducements by the Secret Service, I mentioned end of December '81, and Martella sort of half bribing Adja. So there's pretty hard evidence. And this man doesn't mention one fact. He just makes it a sinister business sponsored by the Soviet bloc countries. This, I would say, is bias that one could not beat in the authoritarian states.
This program was based in part on material from Ed Herman's latest book, The Rise and Fall of the Bulgarian Connection, co-authored by Frank Broadhead and available from Sheridan Square Publications.
Processional, step into that small confessional. They're the guy who's got religion'll tell you if your sin's original. If it is, try playing it safer. Drink the wine and chew the wafer. 2, 4, 6, 8. Time to transubstantiate.